Let's begin in silence as we do. Our silence is a way to affirm, to remind ourselves that we are living in the sacred heart of mystery and that sacred mystery seeks to come alive in us. So if it helps to close your eyes, you can do that. Take a deep breath. And may grace be in our heads and in our thinking. May grace be in our eyes and in our seeing. May grace be in our ears and in our hearing. May grace be in my mouth and Holly's mouth today as we speak. May grace be in our hearts and in our understanding. And may grace be at our ends and at our departing. And our faith is that what we do here benefits everybody on the globe. So no matter who you are, no matter where you are in your spiritual journey, you are celebrated here. I love this painting that I'm using. This is by Terry Thompson. Most of you remember. And you did get an announcement that next Saturday is a happy hour. And get ready. Ready? Next Sunday is a marathon.
Is anyone running it or half? No? You are? No? Oh, okay. You were going to impress me for a second, David.
So last year, on the Saturday before the marathon, Sherry and I walked down to Herman Park, and there was this Middle Eastern grandparents, you could tell by their age, and their little grandson with them, and I sat down because I'm old and I need to sit down and rest. And this little boy was feeding the ducks, which you're not supposed to do, but I said, "Hey, what's your name?" And he said, "Mohammed." And I said, "Oh, it's a great name. That's a wonderful name." And we talked about the ducks in the park and everything. And I said, "How old are you, Mohammed?" And he said, "I'm 5. And I said, "Wow, that's a great age to be." And then to his grandparents, I said, that's a handful.
I was waiting for the punchline.
5 is a handful, right? And I said, "Hey, Mohammed, tomorrow is the Houston Marathon. Are you going to run in it?" And he said, "Yep." 5 years old. I said, "Mohammed, how do you think you'll do?" He said, "I'm going to win." So, if you run next Sunday, I hope you win, but be aware that your route here may be affected. So pray for my wife because she's going to have to walk to get here. So will I, but that's all right.
I'm not walking.
So the title that we have given this time today is From Here to There, and from there to here, and from here to eternity. And in this time today, we're going to explore 2 things. One is how Jesus got from birth to his vocation, and then how we ourselves happen to end up here. So the first part is going to be about how the journey shapes who we are, either consciously or not. And all of this, we think, is going to help us understand what it means to walk the wayless way. So I want to quickly point out that there are 2 extremely important aspects of the birth narrative that we have not covered. One is the story of the wise men, the shepherds, and the star. It may be actually one of the more important parts of the birth narrative. I'm going to talk about that next Sunday. The other thing that we have not talked about is the hymn of Mary, called the Magnificat, and Holly's going to come back and help with that, which may be one of the most overlooked but explosive parts of New Testament teaching. So we're going to talk about that. And we'll also talk in that about those boring genealogies that are in Mark and in Matthew and Luke, and what relevance they have for us. But for today, this historical part is going to focus on what we might call the missing years of Jesus. So after the birth stories, Jesus disappears, except for one rather dramatic incident when he shows up for his baptism, between birth and baptism, we don't know anything.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, and there's this also the second part of what I was going to
You got it? Yeah. Yeah, I think we can speculate just about anything we want in the missing years. One hypothesis that seems reasonable is that Jesus was perhaps studying with a teacher or mentor of sorts. There was definitely a much more common apprentice type of culture at that time. And he seems to have had a spiritual gift from an early age. But this, so he would have kind of been like a novice studying with an older monk. My purpose today, though, is to do three things. One is to illustrate that the Jesus story is a product of his experience. So I'll talk a little bit about what it means that he might be a wounded healer, as a way to understand why his teachings are fundamentally about belonging and freedom. And second, to show you that Jesus has an ethic of what one psychologist calls we, not I or me, and how he fits into a lineage of liberation theology. Jesus wasn't a theologian. He was a teacher. He was an activist. He was a healer and maybe a zealot, most likely a zealot. And then third, to sort of explicate the purpose of the Jesus story in our lives today. What relevance does it have? And I think for me, it is this question: how do we become the Jesuses of our time? In other words, how might we take in these teachings of liberation and belonging and actually live them out?
So last week I made this announcement that I was not going to mention books. And Dr. Jeff McDonald mentioned in his sermon today that already people are breaking their New Year's resolutions. So
that's why I don't make them.
That's probably a good idea. I'm not going to break that resolution either. But if I were to, if I were just to mention the books on Jesus as a historical figure that I have read, not that have been printed, but that I have read that I think are significant, and give maybe a one-sentence summary of those books, we would be here till supper time, because there are thousands of them. I'm not speaking hyperbolically there. There are thousands of such writings. And I really do think it is important to know who Jesus was as a historical figure. Like, for example, why was he crucified? Why was he executed? The teaching of the church is he died for your sins. But I don't think anybody really knows what that means. So people say, well, he died because he claimed to be the Messiah. So did many people in his day. So we have to get under that as a historical figure. And I think Jesus has really been misjudged about his relationship to Judaism. Jesus was a loyal, faithful Jewish mystic. He was a Jew. So there's been this increase in both the quality and the quantity of books that have been written about Jesus as a historical figure over the last 30, 40, 50 years. And the reasons for this are manifold. Globalization has played a part of it. Communication, modernization has played a part of it. I mentioned last week that there has been a varnish of faith put over Jesus in such a way that makes it difficult to peel that varnish away and get to Jesus as a figure of history. And that has changed. There have been people from other faith traditions or no faith tradition at all who have written books about the Jesus of history. We've had advances in linguistics, in archaeology, in cultural studies, so that we know so much more about that time, that part of the world than we did just 20 years ago. I had a friend of mine who a few weeks ago had a valve replaced in his heart. The surgeon cut a vein and put a camera up to his heart through his vein, cut a vein and put the surgical tools in, and replaced a valve in the heart that way.
No chest.
No chest at all. No, none of that. In one day, out the next. I asked a doctor friend of mine about that, and he said, oh, yes, this is becoming the method of choice for that kind of surgery. Now, if you have to do bypass, that's a different thing. But to do that sort of surgery, and it's more effective, the recovery time is shorter, and so it's that's pretty amazing. So there have been comparable advances in biblical studies, just like there have been in medical studies. And communicating those changes is I think as challenging as it would be for that surgeon to communicate to me the advances that have taken place since it was required to crack your chest open to do a valve replacement to being able to go through a vein in your arm to do it. So I'm not going to go try to do that, but I am going to say that behind what we're saying, there is credible, really well-documented academic research that we're not just spinning theories in the air. The fact is that we really don't know much, anything really, about the historical Jesus prior to his appearance of being baptized by John. There have been many theories. Holly mentioned one. I've got some, but nobody knows for sure. If you grew up in the church, you may have seen a painting or a photograph. Not, it wouldn't be a photograph, would it? You may have seen an artist's conception of this, where Jesus is doing carpentry work with his father, Joseph, in the carpenter shop. This is pure romantic fiction.
Yes. Yeah. Yep.
You don't see ours?
Part of the outfit. So, yeah.
There's always a halo over my head when I work on my car.
What? When do you work on your car?
I don't work on my car. That's right. The Greek word that is translated into English as carpenter really means handyman. In our culture, it would be more translated day laborer. And Nazareth is a real small community, so any day laborers in Nazareth would probably have to go to the nearest large place, would have been Sephora's, to get work to do, and then to either spend the night there or to come back to Nazareth to work. There is a story in Luke, which we may or may not get to, because it's not part of the actual history of the story, where we can talk about why it was included, where when Jesus was 12, he and his family, along with a lot of other people, went to an obligatory festival in Jerusalem. And about 3 days back from that festival, Mary and Joseph, being the really astute, good parents that they were, noticed that Jesus was not there.
I think benign negligence is
They
a common
snapped
theme.
to the fact that, hey, didn't we have a kid? And he's not here. So they go back to Jerusalem and they find Jesus in the temple teaching the rabbis. So that's the story. Probably when Jesus was about 12, 13, 14, he did leave home. Because now we know culturally that that's what people did at that age. Jesus' mother was probably 14, 15, 16 when she gave birth to Jesus. So we're talking about a demographic and a cultural that most of us have no experience of. What we do know that if Jesus had gone to Jerusalem when he was 12, he would not have been, even at the age of 12, that's why it's significant, because that's when young Jewish boys are considered to be men, he would not have been admitted to the temple because, and Holly will get into this, he did not have a proper birth. And this is something that the varnish of faith has made it very difficult for us to talk about in public, because Jesus is the Son of God, And we have to honor the virgin birth. And so those two things have kept most education in churches away from saying Jesus was born out of wedlock. And we have terms for that. So just keeping aware that we're going to be talking about that. We're going to talk about two major emphases of Jesus. That of forgiveness and Jesus' radical teaching of God as a loving Father. And the inference that scholars make is that Jesus got to these two major emphases because of his family of origin dynamic. Now, on this one sentence alone, we could spend a month. Most of Jesus' teaching in word and deed is about forgiveness. And this is one of the ways that he broke with Judaism. Because it's not that Jews did not believe that God was loving and compassionate and forgiving, but the Jews believed that God was loving and compassionate and forgiving only if you were pure, if you were clean. And if you weren't, then you had to do something to get that status, or you weren't included. And Jesus said, nope, that's not true. I don't care who you are, I don't care what your condition is, come have a meal with me. Come sit at my table. So that is, if you read one of the Jesus narratives, any one of them, most of the teachings, most of the parables are about forgiveness. And then the other thing is about God as a source of compassion who wanted to embrace all. This is one of the most radical teachings in the Jesus narrative. God makes it rain on the just and the unjust. You don't have to be good to get God's blessing. That was the teaching of Jesus. When I was in seminary, and we talked about this passage, and the professor said, God makes it rain on the just and the unjust. Most radical teaching of Jesus. And then the professor said, however, the just get wetter.
Because they're holding the umbrellas up for the...
Because the unjust have stolen their umbrellas. So these are the topics. And you're going to hear these coming up again and again and again in the future. This is a major, major part of the Jesus body of material.
Yeah. As you were talking, I'm just thinking Jesus took out the middleman in this experience of God, of what is sacred, of what is holy. It took out the middleman in forgiveness and justice, so took out the powers and principalities, if you will, and said, we, all of us, are called to be that, to be forgiving, to be loving, to be just.
And the church has not done any better at being the middleman.
And I think the church is a little scared of that, taking the middleman out, because the church needs...
Well, we'd lose money.
Yeah, you don't have a salary anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But you've seen it in spades. You remember some time ago when the Roman Catholic Church refused communion to those who supported abortion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It wields an enormous amount of power instead of adjusting to the needs. But before I get into this impact of Jesus's life experience on his teachings, I want to explain what a wounded healer is. It comes from the myth of Chiron, who was a centaur and a teacher to Greek heroes like Achilles, Heracles, and the young hero Jason. And Heracles, one of his students, accidentally wounds Chiron with a poison arrow. And Chiron lives in pain for the rest of his life in spite of his ability to continue healing others. So he's in pain as a healer. And if you've ever had your birth chart read, the chances are you've been pointed to where Chiron is in your astrology chart. It's that symbol that looks like an O with a K on top of it. And that's where the wound is. So a wounded healer is someone who develops empathy, understanding, and insights about others through the process of dealing with their own struggles and vulnerabilities. The term was used by Carl Jung, to describe clinicians who draw upon their own experience to help others, so that the therapeutic process or relationship is more about authenticity and presence than it is about being perfect and omniscient and I'll tell you what you need. It's more relational. So that it's precisely our pain that facilitates the healing. Here's how you might behave if you fall into the category of a wounded healer. You might be a lifelong seeker. You might live with a strong sense of purpose. People might call on you when they're in need. You respond to that call for help with ease and grace and have an ability to deal with difficult circumstances. Learn to look at those circumstances as opportunities for growth. That's not silver lining it. At least that's what silver lining is. Well, at least it's just saying this difficulty is also an opportunity for deep learning and deep healing. And then you might remain calm in chaos. So ER doctors. In his introduction, this is not a book recommendation, just a reference. Stephen Mitchell writes that Jesus's great wound was his family of origin pain. And Bill said a few words about why, but the short story is that Jesus knew what it was like to feel on the outside. He didn't belong. He was the bastard son of a teenage mom. And they knew the pain of not belonging in the systems that supported community during that time. If I'm being psychoanalytic about it, I would guess that Jesus may have internalized some anger or resentment about his not belonging, and that he may have even felt that anger and resentment towards his parents for doing that to him. And also towards his community. So what does he do? He creates opportunities inside of the social structures to create belonging outside of the system. If they indeed played up the whole Son of God thing, that alone is a huge burden to bear. No one can fill those shoes. If you see it as a unique position, if we see it as we are all the sons and daughters of God, then we can all fill those shoes. But not belonging is one of the most difficult experiences of being human. I bet each of us has a story of a time in our life where we were bullied, where we didn't belong, where we didn't know where we fit in, and it's painful to dredge that up. It's isolating. It leads to anxiety, loss of self-worth, and even self-sabotage in later relationships. Rejection is such a fundamental hurt that sticks like, I've had to do this as a teacher, like old gum on the bottom of desks. It doesn't come off, especially when it happens in the family of origin. Most of us end up in the therapeutic environment so that we can deal with the wounds of our family of origin. We're not meant to do this in isolation. We're not meant to heal alone. So Mitchell's guess is that perhaps this wound was never fully healed for Jesus. And this explains why he asked people to reject their families and follow him. He even asks one guy, don't go bury your father, come with me. So he fundamentally rejects some of the rules that guided family culture during that time. And to heal his pain, he created communities of belonging that didn't have rigid rules. So as I understand it, his spiritual freedom was not about getting rid of pain, but about finding belonging, peace, community, and compassion in spite of his pain. Spiritual freedom is about relinquishing kind of the grip that your pain or your wound or your trauma has on you, not over-identifying with it. I've heard it said that when we say things like my cancer, my trauma, that we're over-identifying with that, as opposed to saying this is a part of me, a part of life that I have to deal with. So integrating our experience into the entirety of our life. I wonder if this isn't in part what Jesus meant when he says, your faith will make you well. When we let go of the grip, then we have more room for healing and expansion. So there's more to you, to all of us, than the wound. I was just with a friend he's a Jungian analyst also, who did the 10-day Vipassana retreat in December. He did it over the Christmas holiday, actually. And we talked about, his own realization of how gripped he any one of us, put yourself in this position, can become by thoughts and judgments. How often he returns to thoughts, judgments, anxieties, worries. And he shared with me that the guy who founded these retreats, Goenka,
S.N. Goenka,
was a successful Burmese businessman, very wealthy, who suffered from chronic migraines. He was seeking treatment after treatment after treatment. He went abroad, he went to different healers, different doctors, different herbalists to try and get rid of these migraines, and no cure worked. I bet anyone in here who's done the Vipassana knows this story. Is anyone nodding along with me? But finally, he comes to a teacher in his home country in India, and he asks, can I study with you? Can you give me healing and guidance? And the teacher says, if your goal is to get rid of your migraines, I won't work with you. So he leaves, discouraged, still dealing with the migraines, but he comes back eventually a couple months later and decides, okay, I'm ready to work with you regardless of what happens with the migraines. He became his student. This is probably a tradition from which the idea that maybe Jesus studied with a mentor comes from. He studied with a teacher for 14 years. And then he starts these retreats, and eventually his migraines went away. His faith, his letting go of the grip, made him well. So learning to let go of that, of a specific outcome, of our attachment to something. You know, when you get like, it has to go this way, you're like claws. You're like cat's claws in a blanket. Does anyone else have a cat who sleeps on them? My cat is like all night. And we have to learn instead how to become present to the pain as opposed to gripped by it.
So the question that I was asked, and when I have done supervision, would I ask anybody who's getting into the position of being either a psychologist, a psychotherapist, or particularly a clergy person.
Or dang it, even a parent.
Well,
you know?
Yeah, but so many of us enter parenting absolutely unconscious.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, absolutely unconscious. You know? But the question that I was asking, would ask others, what is the neurosis that got you here? And when young clergy hear that, they're really shocked because they think they're responding to the call of God. But they're really responding to a neurosis, which is not bad. It's the way we all live. But if you don't name what it is, then you get caught up in being very judgmental, being very righteous. Boy, this really shows up in political arenas. I have the truth. This is the truth. And instead of, there's a place, as Jesus would say, for everybody at the table. We'll talk about that. I'll talk about that in a minute. So here's a photograph. Everybody's seen. Everybody knows this guy. One of the greatest presidents of the United States. Then there was a poll taken of members of the American Political Science Association that ranked Abraham Lincoln as the greatest president the United States has ever had. Now, at the time of Lincoln's death, he was not so regarded. He was very disliked. I grew up in Tennessee, and even in Tennessee, this person was presented to me as the champion of civil rights. The culture in which I live practiced Jim Crowism to the nth degree. However, we were required to memorize the Gettysburg Address. How ironic is that? To be in Tennessee saying we believe in the equality and everybody, freedom and everybody, and no, you cannot drink at this water fountain. So we see Lincoln as the one who said that blacks and whites deserved equal treatment, that slaves should be set free and allowed the same right as their owners. This is what we have been taught to believe for decades. However, prior to the Civil War, Lincoln is on record as not favoring civil rights. Now, his views changed over time. Ours do too. But how is it that we only remember one part of Lincoln and not the whole story? We don't remember that he publicly stated that, yes, blacks should be set free and then deported to Liberia. He declared that blacks should not be allowed to vote or to serve on juries or to enjoy the privileges and responsibilities of whites in society, because he believed, these are his words, there is a physical difference between blacks and whites that would make equality impossible. Now, that's a memory of Lincoln most of us have never had. So if Lincoln actually stated those things, why do we remember him so differently today? And the answer is complicated to that and not really the purpose of this teaching, but I'm using it as an illustration that the memories of a person, our memories of ourselves, of our parents, of those around us, are shaped by the aims of the stories that have been created by important people in our lives and by ourselves that bring that person from the past into the future. No better example could be found than the wonderful eulogies given about former President Jimmy Carter this week. Does that go?
Yeah.
The past is not a fixed entity back there in time. It is always being transformed in our minds depending on what our minds are occupied with in the here and now. It's not that the facts are inaccurate. We're just highly selective in what we remember and what we choose to remember. This applies to how we remember Jesus. It applies to how we remember our parents. It applies to how we remember that person that we really dislike.
This is not in my notes, but Josh, my husband, loves presidential biographies. And he has we just built extra shelves in our house because we have a major book problem. And I was organizing his books, color-coded. Color-coded and subject-coded. So the subject of presidential histories were on one shelf and color-coded. It's good. But he has about 6 of them on Lincoln. And I was asking him about Lincoln as we were writing this week. And, Lincoln was committed to keeping the Union intact, committed to not dividing the United States. And that was his mission. But, he said words whose morality superseded his own ability to think in the way that he wrote. In other words, like the freedom or the equality of all mankind is a bigger statement than his soul was aligned with. So he put forth an idea that we're still, frankly, trying to live into. So I think Lincoln is so fascinating, and Josh is very much my research department in these areas because I don't love presidential biographies. Even if I love the information about them, they're just kind of boring to me. But he can succinctly kind of summarize. He's my Cliff Notes. But bringing up Lincoln, I think, is important because he wasn't an abolitionist at all. They call him the great emancipator, not an abolitionist. He was not, let's say, an abolitionist in the way that this woman, Harriet Tubman, was, or this woman who none of you know, but she is an asterisk ancestor of mine. And by asterisks, I mean she was never married. So she is not a documented ancestor because she didn't have a husband. She was a poet and an abolitionist who moved. She was a Quaker. So the Quakers were real active abolitionists during this time in the 1820s, And she conducted a stop on the Underground Railroad and was in favor of full inclusion and participation of both Blacks and Native Americans at that time. That emancipation meant full inclusion. participation in the market, participation in politics, participation in housing. But Lincoln does not represent full abolition. He does represent a mark in the evolution of our conscience, an important mark in the evolution of our conscience. And it is our job to continue evolving that. Our ideas about freedom and liberation aren't meant to remain stagnant. They're meant to be responsive to what the moment calls us to do now. It's not looking, this, in quantum entanglement, I do not understand this fully.
I do.
Okay, good. Events of the present can change the past. But this is maybe one of those things that if we can think about it symbolically, that what we do in the present changes our understanding of
that. That is, by the way, one of the central teachings in Buddhism.
Yeah, yeah. So in our country, we're kind of possessed by the idea that freedom is an individual thing, particularly in this state where we live. And that someone gets freedom based on what they deserve or because of their societal standing. We've understood freedom as political rather than as a birthright. We practice what I said earlier, an I and me type of freedom rather than a we and us type of freedom. And true freedom is not won or granted, nor is it an overnight success project. It didn't happen when Lincoln wrote the Gettysburg Address. It didn't happen when he wrote the Emancipation Proclamation. It's an evolving process. And it's also a mindset, a whole picture of reality that we commit to again and again and again. This man who I love, I came to know him during my PhD process, Fritz Kunkel. He was trained as a Jungian, but he further developed psychology or Jungian psychology into what he called a psychology of we, in which we're threaded to one another by our attitudes and actions and interactions. So what we are accountable to is not just our individual becoming or wrongs, we're also accountable to our ancestral, national, and human becoming and or wrongs. So when we do something today, we change the past. We change our ancestors' commitment or non-commitment to action or inaction, to how they lived in according to freedom and liberation. Kunkel's psychology proposes that we are all part of healing the world's pain. We all bear the wound of separation. We need to remember that, to kind of hold it close and tend to it in community. This is, again, back to the idea of the wounded healer. We don't heal alone. But if we can deal with that pain, in our case of our country, of our ancestors, of all of humanity, we all become wounded healers. I think that God loses all meaning for us if we cannot see and respond to God in this world. To know God is to do justice. Our theologies need to inform our actions rather than just justify exclusion, oppression, and violence. When we open ourselves to each other in this way, see each other as freedom-deserving beings, then we are infinitely open to sacred mystery. And then we're really, truly free. We're experiencing freedom together. Responses to our religious traditions, in my opinion, and well, this is also not just Holly's opinion, this is a liberation theology opinion or philosophy, that they need to be grounded in current context and what is needed right now. Liberation theology is a way of actively interpreting sacred scriptures through the lens of the poor and oppressed, whoever that is identified as in any given society, which is going to change from place to place to place and from time to time to time. It's a way of advocating for social change through political action, community organizing, and solidarity with those who are on the margins. Liberation theology is always political. Jesus's way of being a religious person was also political, not partisan, but political. As we know, faith is not just a set of beliefs, but this evolving, entangled thing that bounds us up to one another and to the origin of things, as well as to this long arc of time that we become part of. Jesus was not a theologian, I said that earlier, but he is certainly in this lineage of of liberators, let's say. It was his attitude towards the poor and the dispossessed from which liberation theology evolves. Any Jesuits in here who went to Jesuit school maybe? Okay, yeah, the Jesuits are the ones who really brought liberation theology into the forefront in Latin America. It was in the 1950s that, as a response to poverty and injustice that was sanctioned by the state, that these and the church, but the state and the church are again intertwined, that they were helping the peasants and the poor and the farmers to gain their own freedom. It's always place specific. So in Bolivia, when I was there, I remember them telling us that for a long time, water has been taxed exorbitantly. So the farmers then couldn't water their crops, which couldn't feed the people. So it's a spiraling effect. So what the Jesuits did in Bolivia is different than what they might have done in El Salvador, but they helped the farmers to protest the taxation of the water so that they could feed their crops and then feed the people. The Jesuits listened to, and listening is a big part of liberation theology. What is it that you need to get free? The Jesuits didn't come in with the idea that I know what you need to get free, but what is it that you need to get free? They spoke truth to power. So from Latin America, we have liberation philosophy, liberation psychology, and then pedagogy. Paulo Freire, a big liberation pedagogical teacher, was born and spread into other countries and contexts. In the U.S., liberation theology became first popular among Black theologians in the 1950s and 60s. Among them, the most popular is James Cone. And he would say to white theologians and white parishioners that we need to learn to think Black if we are to understand the oppression of Black folks in America. For him, this meant to actively consider the scriptures through that perspective. How do we reinterpret scriptures so that we understand the lens of freedom and liberation according to the Black experience? That's how we become allies. From there, liberation theology evolved into queer theory, Native American, feminist theory, there's Asian American liberation theology. Any group that has been marginalized or dispossessed then begins to interpret and write about scriptures from their experience of being oppressed. When we listen to these voices, we learn how we can step alongside and work toward freedom together. So the goal, as I said, is to consider scripture through that lens of experience, not as a stagnant thing, not as something that only meant one thing one time and that we ought to live into that one thing. It's expansive. And it's our call, I think, to understand society from a multiracial, multi-ethnic, multicultural perspective so that we might continually fight against oppression.
So one of the reasons that I came to Houston was to be pastor of Covenant Church, which still is in existence over here. And that church came into existence because of the racial conflict that was about to brew in Houston in the 60s, in 1964, 65. What saved Houston from much of the uproar that existed in the rest of the nation was NASA. And Bill Lawson and a number of other people who came together who said, you know, if we're gonna do this, you should read the history about how we didn't have any cable TV. They control the media.
Yeah, they shut the media down for several days.
They control the media to keep news about what was happening in Detroit and other places out of the news.
Have you seen the documentary, The Strange Demise of
Yeah.
That is an absolute recommendation.
And Bill Austin and I were connected intimately during that time. So that was the reason of the church. I don't know if I still have it, but there was a headline in either the Post or the Chronicle where it showed a photograph of the pastor of the First Methodist Church in Houston. They turned away Black people who went to worship as a protest. I mean, you know, they knew they were going to get in. And the pastor of that church was quoted as saying, "This is in the best interest of the Lord's work."
Wow. He got that part wrong.
about 4 or 5 months after that, I was involved in a course of study in Union Seminary in New York, 1967. And there was this young black guy who shows up to lecture us.
Yeah.
It was James Cone.
Yeah.
And he was talking this stuff in 1967.
And he has this real little voice. Yeah.
And I thought, this is not going to play well when I take it home
Yeah.
to a lot of people.
And I bet a part of you was kind of like, what?
I had this sense that I was in the presence of something.
Yeah.
And another thing in thinking about Jesus and about history is how I have seen my father differently over the years. What I would say to people is, if you can see your parents as people, take them out of that, don't call them mom and dad, call them other names, become peers with them, and begin to talk to them about what made them the people they are.
Yeah.
And then you will begin to see that we all do the best we can with the awareness that we have at the time, and we all always think we're right.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true.
Of course, I am.
Yeah, well, we can arm wrestle over that one.
I am always right. Everybody's always right.
Yeah.
Now, why is all this important? Well, for at least 2 reasons about this wayless way that we're going to try to follow in the weeks and months ahead. One has to do with how we got from there to here. Knowing your own personal history, knowing the personal history of other people, knowing the personal history of people that we look up to, that's important. How'd the country get from there to here? How'd some other country get from there to here? All that's very important to know. And the other is, now what? What do we do with that so that we can decide what's next? So what we have in the narratives of Jesus are memories of Jesus that were shaped after his death. It's not that they are true or factual, at least factual to some degree, but they were shaped to create a particular message and to achieve a particular goal. Now we have to talk about what that is. But it was primarily to create a story about forgiveness and compassion in the social political context in which those stories were created. And we'll really get to that next week when we talk about wise men, shepherds, stars in the sky, and angels that sing. Those are all political statements. They also make nice Christmas carols. But they were about this historical figure that those Jewish people in that time said, we experience God through this man, through what he said and did. And so that the stories are stories about a movement from darkness to light, from bondage to freedom, from death to light. And over and over, you're going to hear those themes. Over and over. In every aspect of the Jesus narrative, these things are going to show up again and again and again. So our memories about how we got here are also things that are not set in stone. They're created stories that were handed to us or that we created ourselves that may not serve us well. And if they don't, we can change them. We're free to reshape and reinterpret so that we can do that in service of freedom and love. The meaning of these stories don't stop with us either. They are about radical hospitality. They're about total authenticity. They're about true diversity. They're about agenda-free relationships. So Jesus used his birth circumstances and early life experiences to craft an understanding of how he was to live his life that embraced everyone and that focused on speaking the truth and did not other people and did not seek to change people before he said, come on, let's go get some Mexican food. These things are very important about how we're living in this very time, in this very divided country. And they are incredibly challenging. I personally confess to you that I have yet to figure out a way to sit at the table with somebody who says 2 + 2 = 5.
Yeah.
You understand what I'm saying? So if somebody says, here's a set of facts that I can see in a photograph, don't match what they're saying, I have trouble getting my head around that. I'm working on it. Pray for me.
Yeah.
I'm serious, because I don't want to be divided, but I just can't accept an untruth as truth.
Yeah. I love those tenets of relationship as kind of the wayless way, that these principles guide us more than sticking to the literal interpretation of words themselves. And I think they slide right into this guy's theology, what Dietrich Bonhoeffer called a religionless Christianity. And again, this is a way of being rather than a way of believing. He's of this lineage of people who ask us also to consider that God is in the world, needing our response, rather than an out there. Someone said to me the other day, I've given up on Sky Daddy God. Anyways, this idea that God is in you and me and continuously revealed in the way that we treat each other. We have to be willing to live for the same things that we're willing to die for. Dietrich Bonhoeffer certainly was. He was murdered for being anti-Nazi. I read this beautiful story on EJI's Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery, Alabama. Sorry, I went too fast on that slide. Anyone visited that? It's Bryan Stevens's monument to Jim Crow South, to enslavement, and to the history of the South's participation in all of that. But they have this project about collecting dirt that is very, very, very well researched about sites where people have been murdered by lynching. And people go and they collect dirt from these sites, and it becomes part of this wall of memory at EJI's site, where you see all the dirt collected from all of the spots where they can identify through history and records that someone was lynched there. So this woman is signed up to be among a team of people collecting dirt samples. She is a Black woman, and she's in the Deep South. She goes to her assigned place alone with a jar and a shovel. Not long after she starts, a truck drives up, slows past her, and then stops and reverses. This older white man gets out and says, "What are you doing here?" Her heart's thudding. She decides she's going to be honest and be matter of fact, and says, "I'm collecting dirt samples for this jar meant to commemorate death by lynching." This man pauses. She's not sure what he's going to do. And then he says, "May I help?" The woman is shocked and says, "Of course." So they are digging the dirt in silence together, filling this jar up. And after a time, this man starts to just dig more ferociously, and he starts to weep. The woman is like, "What's wrong?" And he says, "My family is from here. We've been here for a long time, and I'm pretty sure my ancestors were part of this lynching. And I want to make that right." That's liberation. Healing the past in the present, changing the past by doing something now. Digging in the dirt together, filling a jar with dirt, with recognition and remembrance. This somehow lessens the burden that an individual must carry. This is we-ness, bearing that burden, bearing that pain together. So in liberation, we deal with the sins of our ancestors in order to begin to imagine a more free future. I hope we can lighten the load for our descendants. I'll skip right to this, two things, which is when we are thinking, I want to participate in this liberation thing, it's not a set of beliefs. It's not even a particular movement. It's a way of being. a way of responding to what's right in front of us. And two questions that we can sort of ask ourselves is, what am I doing to get free? And how am I living in such a way that others can get free? And when we think about being liberators, the basic guidelines might be these. Again, not a set of beliefs, not even and here's how you do it. You have to figure out how to do it where you are socially located. My friend always says, fight where you stand. So where you stand is going to need something different than where your neighbor stands. But creating community, finding your strengths, bringing your particular set of skills, seeking knowledge, building inclusive movements with a mind toward listening to the poor and the historically oppressed, practicing integrity and showing up intentionally, especially in discomfort. Prioritize the care and healing of the self and others, embrace accountability and authenticity, and lead with love and curiosity. I think this is how we do God forever and ever.
So I have a few other comments to make, but we're out of time. You can read them on the line. I want to close with something else. It's about using the circumstances of our lives to create our future, that it's not closed, that we can create given the value system that we're inheriting from walking the wayless way. Okay, that. I want to close with this. Some of you have heard me say I've been taking this course on the works of Meister Eckhart online, and I want to close with something by Meister Eckhart that is translated by John Sweeney. We often worry about where God is, while all the while, God is wondering where we are. But so where are you? Don't worry about the destination. After all, your journey is on a wayless way. Concentrate on that. And don't concern yourself with where you should go or what you should do. Choose to live so that your whole life becomes love. When you do, the rest will follow. I love you.
Love you too.
I'm so glad we did this. Thank you all for being here.